The story begins with the sharp, metallic ring of Caroline's sledgehammer striking something that isn't solid rock. The sound echoed in the tight, dusty confines of the collapsed tunnel, a hollow thud that promised something more than just another day of back-breaking labor. Dust motes danced in the beam of her headlamp, illuminating a section of the tunnel wall that looked different, a carefully constructed plug of stone disguised as rubble. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic rhythm matching the echo. This single moment, this unexpected sound, was about to change not only her life but the history of the entire valley. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The entrance to the old Blackwood Pass tunnel was a dark, gaping maw nestled in a ridge of the Appalachian Mountains, a place where the air was always crisp with the scent of pine and damp earth. Overgrown vines, thick as a man's wrist, clung to the stone archway, and a formidable rockfall, a chaotic jumble of slate and soil, choked the opening. It looked less like an abandoned piece of infrastructure and more like a natural cave, a place where the mountain had decided to swallow a piece of its own history. This was Caroline Hayes's new office. In her late 30s, she possessed a wiry strength that wasn't born in a gym but forged in the unforgiving landscapes of 2 tours as an Army combat engineer. Her movements were efficient, deliberate, each swing of a pickaxe, each lift of a timber a study in conserved energy. A quiet intensity was etched into the corners of her eyes, a look that could assess a structural weakness or spot a tripwire with equal, unnerving calm. But beneath that focus, a deep weariness resided, the kind that came from seeing too much and sleeping too little. She was a single mother now, her world narrowed and sharpened to a single point of focus. Her 10-year-old daughter, Lily. This tunnel, this crumbling passage of forgotten commerce, was more than just a project. It was a new mission. After years of following orders, of building and demolishing in the service of a cause she sometimes struggled to understand, this felt different. This was hers. It was a way to channel the skills that hummed restlessly beneath her skin, to fight a different kind of battle, not against an enemy, but against decay and time itself. Here, she could build something permanent, something that would serve her daughter and her community. She paused, leaning on the handle of her shovel, and let her gaze drift up to the formidable collapse. A brief, imagined conversation, a familiar routine of grief and memory, played in her mind. "You'd call me crazy, David?" she thought, a faint smile touching her lips. The image of her late husband, a fellow soldier with a grin that could disarm a general, was as clear as the mountain air. "But you'd be right here with me, swinging a bigger hammer." The thought didn't bring the usual sharp pang of loss, but a dull, familiar ache, a phantom limb of a life that had been amputated too soon. He would have loved this, the sheer, stubborn challenge of it. The thought solidified her resolve, turning the ache into fuel. She was not just clearing a tunnel, she was honoring a memory, proving that even after the greatest collapse, you could still build something new. The memory of the county clerk's office was still vivid, a stark contrast to the open mountain air. The office had been stuffy, smelling of old paper, stale coffee, and the faint, sweet scent of the clerk's pipe tobacco. It was a room where time seemed to move at a slower, more deliberate pace. Caroline had stood before the wide oak desk, her proposal laid out with military precision, feeling the weight of local history pressing in on her. She had spent weeks researching, drafting, and planning, and it all came down to this meeting with the railroad trust representative, a man who communicated via a crackly speakerphone from a city hundreds of miles away. To her surprise, the trust was more than happy to grant her a long-term lease on the decommissioned tunnel for a nominal fee. The disembodied voice on the phone had called it the condemned passage, a liability they were eager to offload. The real challenge wasn't the distant corporation, but the man sitting across from her. Mr. Henderson, the elderly town clerk, had peered at her over the top of his spectacles, his eyes magnified into watery blue orbs. He was a fixture in the town, a living repository of its stories and secrets. He tapped a gnarled finger on the faded map spread between them. "That tunnel's been sealed since the big collapse in 48 Caroline," he'd said, his voice a gravelly murmur. My own grandfather, he ran the hardware store back then. He said it was cursed. Said the mountain wanted it back. Caroline had met his gaze with a calm, confident smile, a look she had perfected for reassuring nervous junior officers. I've dealt with worse than curses, sir, she had replied, her voice even and steady. The interaction had set the tone for her reception in the small town of Blackwood. She was an outsider, a veteran with invisible scars and a wild idea. Some townsfolk were intrigued, offering a friendly nod at the diner, but most saw her as an eccentric, another dreamer chasing a pipe dream into the side of a mountain that preferred to be left alone. They'd watch her drive by in her dusty pickup truck, a sledgehammer and coils of rope in the back, and shake their heads with a mixture of pity and amusement. They didn't see the engineer, the soldier, the survivor. They saw a woman trying to tame a ghost. Inside the tunnel, the world outside ceased to exist. The first 100 feet were a claustrophobic tube of damp, sweating rock that seemed to press in from all sides. The only light came from the powerful battery-operated work lamps she had set up, their stark white beams cutting through the oppressive darkness, and the focused ray of her own headlamp, which bobbed and weaved with her every movement. The air was cold and still, thick with the smell of wet slate, decaying timbers, and her own sweat. A constant, rhythmic drip of water from the ceiling served as a maddening metronome, each drop echoing in the profound silence. The groan of aging support timbers, stressed by the immense weight of the mountain above, sounded like the sighs of a sleeping giant. The physical toll of the work was immense, a brutal, grinding reality that settled deep into her bones. By the end of each day, her shoulders burned with a fiery ache, new blisters rose on her calloused hands, and she could feel the grit of rock dust between her teeth. Yet, in this harsh, unforgiving environment, her expertise shone. She moved with a purpose that was almost balletic in its efficiency. Her army training had taught her to read the language of stress and pressure, and here, she applied it not to concrete bunkers but to the living rock of the mountain. She could see the subtle stress fractures in the slate, understanding how the pressure from above was distributed, where the weak points were, and how to counter them. She wasn't just clearing debris. She was performing a delicate, high-stakes surgery on the earth itself. Meticulously, she cleared away the loose rock and soil, inspected every inch of the exposed rock face, and shored up the tunnel with new timbers. Their fresh CDE sent a welcome contrast to the ancient dampness. There were moments of doubt, of course. Alone in the deep, suffocating dark, the sheer weight of the mountain above felt personal, a malevolent presence waiting for a single mistake. The financial precarity of their situation was a constant, gnawing anxiety. Every dollar she spent on lumber and equipment was a dollar not saved for Lily's future. This project was a huge gamble, a roll of the dice with their entire fragile stability. But then, she would close her eyes and picture it, the finished tunnel, clean and safe, with a string of lights like a buried constellation. She would imagine the whir of bicycle wheels on smooth pavement, the laughter of families echoing where only the drip of water and the groan of rock had been heard for decades. She would think of Lily, her bright, curious daughter, and the pride in her eyes. The thought of creating a local landmark, of leaving a legacy of connection rather than destruction, was the fuel that burned away the doubt and powered her through the pain. Weeks bled into a month, then 2. The pile of excavated rock and dirt at the tunnel's entrance grew into a small hill, a testament to her slow, painstaking progress. She had cleared the initial, chaotic rockfall and was now deep into the heart of the collapse, a section nearly 70 years old. The air here was thicker, the silence more profound, as if she had moved beyond the reach of the outside world entirely. It was here that things began to change. The debris was no longer a random jumble of slate and earth. She began to encounter stones that were fitted together, their edges meeting with an unnatural precision. She had reached a section that seemed unnaturally stable, a solid wall of carefully placed stones standing firm amidst the surrounding chaos. It was a barrier, not a collapse. She switched off her work lamps, plunging the tunnel into a near, total darkness broken only by her headlamp. The focused beam allowed her to see the details more clearly, to trace the faint, almost invisible lines of mortar that bound the stones together. She ran a gloved hand over the surface, feeling the texture. It was too deliberate, too well constructed for a natural event. This was man-made. A surge of adrenaline, cold and sharp, cut through her exhaustion. Her geological hammer, a familiar weight in her hand, felt like an extension of her own senses. She began to tap it against the wall, listening intently to the resonance, the way the sound traveled through the stone and back to her. Tap, tap, thud. The sound was dense, solid, just as she expected. She moved the hammer a few feet to the right. Tap, tap, thud. Again solid rock. She worked her way across the wall, a systematic grid search learned in another lifetime, for another purpose. Then, near the bottom, just a foot or so above the tunnel floor, the sound changed. Tap, tap, thump. It was a hollow, resonant echo, a deep, bass note that spoke of empty space behind it. The sound vibrated through the handle of the hammer, up her arm, and settled in her chest. It was the same feeling she'd get just before breaching a door in a dusty, sun-baked war zone. A potent cocktail of intense, burning curiosity and primal, instinctual caution. The story of the mountain, the one Mr. Henderson had spoken of, was about to reveal a secret chapter. All the whispers of curses and lost souls, all the skepticism from the town, it all faded away, replaced by this single, resonant fact. Something was in there. She took a deep, steadying breath, the air cold and heavy in her lungs. The dust motes swirled in her headlamp's beam like a galaxy of tiny, silent witnesses. She squared her shoulders, adjusted her grip, and raised the heavy sledgehammer, its polished head gleaming in the solitary light. She was no longer just an engineer clearing a passage. She was an explorer on the verge of a discovery, ready to uncover whatever secret the mountain, and the men who had worked it, had sealed away in the dark. The sledgehammer felt impossibly heavy. For a moment, Caroline considered a single, decisive blow, a release of all the pent-up frustration and exhaustion from the past months. But her training took over, smothering the impulse with a cold dose of discipline. A blind swing could bring down more of the mountain, could destroy whatever lay behind the wall, or worse, entomb her right here. She set the sledgehammer down with a quiet thud and picked up a hammer and a long, sharp chisel. This required surgery, not demolition. She knelt, her headlamp beam focused on a faint seam of mortar. The work was agonizingly slow, a painstaking process of chipping away at the hardened binding. Each strike sent a puff of acrid dust into the air and a jarring vibration up her arm. The sound was small, intimate, a secret conversation between her steel and the old stone. Hours melted away in the suffocating dark, marked only by the changing of the batteries in her headlamp and the growing pile of mortar dust at her knees. She worked with a focused intensity, her world shrinking to this single task. There was no room for thoughts of Lily, of unpaid bills, of the town's skepticism. There was only the chisel's edge and the slow, grudging surrender of the wall. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she felt a subtle shift. A deep groan echoed from the stone as she leveraged her crowbar into the groove she had created. It was the sound of a seal breaking, of a long-held breath being released. She put her shoulder into it, her muscles screaming in protest, and with a final, grinding scrape, the central stone plug gave way, tipping inward into the darkness. A wave of air, ancient and untouched, poured out of the opening, washing over her. It was a physical presence, a ghost exhaling after 70 years of silence. The smell was overwhelming, a complex tapestry of scents that told a story. It smelled of profound dryness, of dust that had never known moisture, of the faint, sweet decay of dry rot, and something else, something she couldn't quite place, a faint, papery scent like a long, abandoned library. It was the smell of time itself. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She retrieved her most powerful flashlight, its beam cutting a brilliant white spear into the absolute black. She pushed the light through the narrow opening. The beam didn't hit a rock wall a few feet away. It illuminated a space, a small, man-made alcove, meticulously carved from the rock, about 10 feet deep and 6 feet high. It was perfectly dry, a testament to the skill of the men who had built it, a pocket of preservation hidden within the damp, weeping mountain. And stacked neatly inside, like coffins in a crypt, were about a dozen dark, wooden shipping crates. With her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs, Caroline wriggled her way through the tight opening, scraping her jacket on the rough, hewn stone. The air inside the alcove was even more concentrated, the scent of old paper and dry wood filling her lungs. She stood up, her headlamp beam dancing across the confined space. It felt like a tomb, a sacred, forgotten place. She ran her light over the crates. They were solidly built, bound with metal straps, and covered in a thick layer of fine, gray dust. On the side of each one, stenciled in faded black letters that were still perfectly legible, were the words, Farm Equipment, Henderson and Sons Hardware. Henderson. The name jolted her. Mr. Henderson, the town clerk, his watery eyes peering over his spectacles, his voice murmuring about curses and his grandfather's hardware store. A wave of confusion, so potent it felt like a physical blow, washed over her, followed by a sharp, bitter tang of disappointment. Farm equipment, all this, the secret wall, the hollow sound, the weeks of back-breaking labor, for a hidden cache of old plowshares and tractor parts? It felt like a cosmic joke, an anticlimax of epic proportions. She had imagined treasure, a lost vein of gold, anything but this. But as the initial disappointment subsided, her analytical mind, the engineer's mind, began to whir. The logic didn't track. The meticulous construction of the wall, the seamless way it had been disguised as part of the collapse, the sheer effort involved spoke of something far more valuable than farm tools. Her internal voice, the one that had assessed countless structural challenges, was blunt. Farm equipment? She thought, her lips twisting into a wry smile. You don't seal a ton of rock and risk a tunnel collapse to hide a few plows. Her curiosity, a powerful and persistent force, quickly overrode her disappointment. The label was a lie. It had to be. The only question was what truth it was hiding. She chose the most accessible crate, the one nearest the opening, and wedged the tip of her crowbar under its lid. The wood was old and dry, but the long nails that held it shut were stubborn, sunk deep into the grain. She put her weight into the crowbar, and the nails protested with a high, piercing screech that echoed horribly in the small, silent space. It sounded like a scream. The lid popped up a few inches. She worked the crowbar around the edge, the screeching nails a soundtrack to her mounting anticipation. Finally, with a last groan of splintering wood, the lid came free. She tossed it aside and shone her light inside. Her breath caught in her throat. It was not the cold, hard gleam of metal parts. The crate was filled to the brim with straw, so old and dry it crackled at the touch of her light's beam. And nestled within the straw, packed tightly together, were dozens of identical cylinders, each one carefully wrapped in dark, waxy oilcloth and securely tied with twine. The brittle crackle of the old straw was the only sound as she reached in. The waxy, slightly oily feel of the cloth was strange, a texture from another time. The sheer number of cylinders was staggering. They filled the entire crate, a dense, mysterious cargo. With trembling hands, she lifted one out. It was heavier than she expected, dense and solid. She placed it on the dusty floor and began to work at the knotted twine. Her fingers, clumsy with cold and adrenaline, fumbled with the knot. Giving up, she pulled her utility knife from her belt and carefully sliced the cord. She peeled back the stiff, waxy oilcloth, crackled like old parchment. Inside was another layer of protection, a tightly rolled sheet of waxed paper. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. She peeled back the edge of the paper, her movements slow, deliberate, almost reverent. And then she saw it. Not metal, not documents, but the intricate, engraved patterns of currency. She peeled the paper back further to reveal a thick, tight bundle of bills. They were larger than modern ones, their designs unfamiliar, bearing the portrait of a stern, forgotten statesman. On the top bill, in elegant scrolling script, were the words Merchants Bank of the Valley. And below that, a date, 1931. Disbelief crashed over her. A dizzying, vertiginous wave that made the solid rock floor seem to tilt beneath her feet. She sat back hard on her heels, the flashlight beam shaking violently in her hand, sending frantic shadows dancing across the walls of the alcove. Money. It was full of money. She scrambled back to the crate and grabbed another cylinder, her movements now frantic. She tore at the oilcloth, ripped away the waxed paper. It was the same. Another thick bundle of the same old currency. She grabbed another, and another, her breath coming in ragged gasps. They were all the same. The entire crate was filled with them. Crates. Plural. She looked at the other 11 crates stacked in the darkness, silent and waiting. It wasn't a discovery. It was a fortune. Her mind, usually so clear and ordered, raced, unable to process the scale of it. She tried to calculate the value, the implications, but the numbers were too big, too abstract. This was life, changing, terrifying, and utterly, completely overwhelming. This was the kind of secret that crushed people. Later that night, the small, rented house felt like a flimsy stage set, the familiar comfort of its four walls offering no defense against the enormity of what she had found. Lily was asleep in her room, her breathing a soft, steady rhythm in the quiet house, a sound that anchored Caroline to the real world. Caroline sat at her small kitchen table, the cheerful floral pattern of the tablecloth a bizarre counterpoint to the object resting upon it. It was a single, dusty bill from 1931. She couldn't bring herself to take more, to bring the ghost of that fortune fully into her home. It felt like a violation, a desecration of both the tomb in the mountain and the fragile piece of her own life. The single bill was enough. It was a tangible link, a heavy, history-soaked artifact that felt dangerous to the touch. She opened her laptop, the modern glow of the screen illuminating her strained face. She typed "Bank Run of 1931 Appalachian Valley" into the search bar. The results flooded in: articles from historical societies, digitized newspaper archives, and academic papers. She learned about a regional panic, a domino effect of fear that had caused several local banks to fail in the early years of the Great Depression. The Merchants Bank of the Valley had been one of them. According to one article, in a desperate attempt to move its assets to a more secure location before the regulators arrived, the bank had dispatched a courier with a significant portion of its cash reserves. The courier, a young man, had vanished without a trace, along with the money. The authorities at the time assumed he had stolen it and fled, a common enough story in those desperate years. The tunnel collapse of '48 was a separate, later event. This money, she realized, was from an even earlier collapse, one lost to local memory, a secret the mountain had kept for much longer. The reality of the situation settled over her, cold and heavy as the stone that had hidden it. This wasn't just found money, a lottery win from the earth. It was a piece of history, a ghost's final, undelivered package. It was the last act of a man who had died alone in the dark, trying to do his job. Her military training, a voice of duty and protocol that had been drilled into her for years, kicked in with absolute clarity. This isn't yours. This is evidence. This belongs to history, to the law. The proper procedure was to secure the site, report the finding, and turn it over to the authorities. But another voice, a softer, more desperate whisper, rose to challenge it. It was the voice of a struggling single mother, the woman who counted every dollar, who lay awake at night worrying about a future that felt balanced on a knife's edge. That voice spoke of all the things this money could do. Could pay off the mountain of debt she had accumulated since David's death. It could buy a real house, a home with a yard for Lily to play in, a place they owned, that no one could take from them. It could secure Lily's future forever, college, anything she wanted, a life free from the constant, grinding worry that had defined Caroline's own. The internal conflict was immense, a war being waged in the quiet of her kitchen. The soldier versus the mother, duty versus desire, the past versus the future. The next morning, the rising sun did little to dispel the shadows under her eyes. Lily came into the kitchen, her hair still messy from sleep, and gave her a hug. "You look tired, Mom," she said, her young voice filled with concern. Caroline forced a smile, the muscles in her face feeling stiff and unnatural. "Just thinking about the tunnel, sweetie," she said, her voice strained. "It's a bigger job than I thought." The simple, innocent exchange felt like a betrayal. For the first time, there was a wall between them, a secret as vast and dark as the tunnel itself. Later, after Lily had left for school, Caroline stood by the phone, her hand hovering over the keypad. She had looked up the number for the county sheriff's office. Her finger trembled just above the digits, suspended in a moment of impossible choice, the entire weight of the mountain, its history, and her own future pressing down on her. The first rays of morning sun streamed into Caroline's kitchen, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, each one a tiny, glittering secret. The light was clean and hopeful, a stark, almost cruel contrast to the dark, heavy secret that had settled in her chest. On the table, beside a cold cup of coffee, the single bill from 1931 lay like a dead leaf, a relic of a buried world. All night, she had waged a silent war with herself, pacing the small house as Lily slept peacefully, unaware of the earthquake that had just shaken the foundations of their lives. The soldier in her, the engineer, saw a clear protocol. A discovery of this magnitude was not a personal windfall. It was a historical and legal event. It required reporting, documentation, and a surrender to the proper authorities. It was about order, procedure, and duty, the principles that had governed her entire adult life. But the mother in her, the woman who had scrimped and saved and worried for a decade, saw a miracle. She saw a future for Lily free from the anxieties that had shadowed her own childhood. She saw a home, security, an end to the relentless, grinding pressure of just getting by. The two voices were locked in a brutal, irreconcilable conflict. Her hand, which could expertly field strip a rifle or calibrate a surveyor's transit, trembled as it hovered over the telephone. She thought of David. He had been a man of unwavering integrity, a soldier who believed in the chain of command, in doing the right thing even when no one was watching. He would have told her to make the call without a second thought. The memory of his conviction, of his clear, uncomplicated moral compass, was the final push she needed. The soldier won. Her finger descended, pressing the numbers with a grim finality. The phone rang twice before a calm, slightly bored voice answered. "County Sheriff's Dispatch." Caroline's own voice, when it came, was steady, a practiced calm she had used 100 times to report situations over a crackling radio. "My name is Caroline Hayes," she said, her eyes fixed on the floral pattern of the tablecloth. "I'm calling to report an unusual discovery at the old Blackwood Pass tunnel site." She was intentionally, carefully vague. There was no way to explain a 70-year-old secret and a mountain of cash to a dispatcher. "Unusual how, ma'am?" the voice asked, a hint of automated patience in the tone. "You'll want to see for yourself," Caroline replied, the words feeling inadequate and immense at the same time. "It's a significant find." There was a pause, the sound of typing. "Okay, Ms. Hayes, I'm sending a deputy to your location. ETA 15 minutes. I'll meet him at the tunnel entrance," she said and hung up. The click of the phone severing the connection was deafening in the quiet kitchen. The secret was no longer hers alone. The ripple effect had begun. The crunch of tires on the gravel access road announced their arrival. A standard county sheriff's cruiser pulled up, and two men got out. The first was older, in his 50s, with a face that looked like it had been carved from weathered oak and a belly that strained the buttons of his uniform shirt. This had to be Sheriff Brody. His expression was one of deep, ingrained skepticism, the look of a man who had spent 30 years listening to tall tales and mediating neighborhood disputes. The second was a deputy, young and eager, his eyes wide with the possibilities of the day. "Ms. Hayes?" Sheriff Brody asked, his voice a low rumble. His gaze swept over her, taking in the dusty work clothes, the tired lines around her eyes. "I'm Sheriff Brody. You reported a discovery." The pause was deliberate, freighted with doubt. He clearly expected this to be a waste of his time, another local eccentric who'd found a strangely shaped rock or some old moonshine equipment. Something like that, Caroline replied, her voice even. She gestured toward the dark maw of the tunnel. It's inside. You'll want to see for yourself. Brody exchanged a weary look with his deputy, who was practically vibrating with anticipation. All right, lead the way. The transition from the bright, warm morning to the tunnel's cold, oppressive dark was instantaneous. The temperature dropped 20 degrees, and the air grew thick with the smell of damp earth and decay. Brody grunted as he navigated the uneven floor, his polished boots ill-suited for the terrain. You've been clearing this all by yourself? The young deputy asked, his voice filled with genuine admiration as he looked at the neat stacks of new support timbers. Most of it, Caroline said, not breaking her stride. She led them past the point where she had worked for months, deeper into the mountain's gut, to the place where the air grew still and the silence was absolute. She stopped before the section of wall with the dark, rectangular opening near the floor. Here, she said simply. She clicked on her powerful flashlight, the same one she had used the night before, and aimed its brilliant white beam through the hole. The young deputy, peering over her shoulder, let out a sharp, involuntary gasp. Sheriff Brody, who had been hanging back with an air of bored impatience, moved forward. What in God's name? He knelt, his knees cracking in protest, and stared into the alcove. His skepticism, so firmly entrenched just moments before, melted away, replaced by a look of pure, slack, jawed astonishment. The beam of light illuminated the scene with stark clarity. The dark wooden crates, the splintered lid of the opened one, and the tightly packed, cloth-wrapped cylinders within. For a long moment, the only sound was the rhythmic drip of water from somewhere deeper in the tunnel. Brody slowly looked up from the opening, his eyes finding Caroline's in the gloom. The look of a man dealing with a time waster was gone. He was looking at her now as if seeing her for the first time, not as an eccentric, but as the harbinger of something impossible. Ma'am, he said, his voice barely a whisper, I think you'd better tell me exactly what we're looking at. Within 2 hours, the quiet solitude of the Blackwood Pass tunnel was shattered. The site, which had been Caroline's private sanctuary for months, was transformed into a chaotic hub of official activity. The entrance was cordoned off with a perimeter of bright yellow police tape, a jarring slash of modernity against the ancient, vine-covered stone. County vehicles were parked haphazardly on the gravel access road, their radios crackling with clipped, professional chatter. The scene had a surreal quality, like a movie set had been dropped onto her life. Caroline stood to one side, feeling like a stranger at her own party. She had given her statement, a simple, factual account of the discovery, and now she was a bystander, watching as her secret was processed, catalogued, and taken from her. Just before noon, a sleek black sedan, impossibly clean, made its way carefully up the rough road. A woman emerged from the driver's side. She was in her 40s, dressed in a crisp, dark pantsuit and heels that were completely impractical for the terrain. Her hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and her expression was one of sharp, no-nonsense efficiency. She moved with an air of authority that immediately set her apart from the county officials. I'm Eleanor Albright, she announced to Sheriff Brody, extending a hand but not waiting for a handshake. I represent the legal department of the Atlantic Railroad Trust. Brody, who had been overseeing the careful removal of the first crate, straightened up, his face hardening. Ms. Albright, this is now a county investigation site. An investigation on our property, Sheriff? She countered, her voice smooth but with an edge of steel. The Blackwood Pass Tunnel and everything in it remains the legal property of the trust. We appreciate Ms. Hayes reporting this, but let's be clear about jurisdiction. The tension between them was immediate and palpable, a clash of local authority and corporate power. Ms. Albright then turned her sharp, analytical gaze on Caroline. You understand, Ms. Hayes, she said, her tone not unkind but pointedly legalistic, that by the terms of your lease agreement, any such discoveries, historical or otherwise, are subject to the ownership claims of the trust. Your lease grants you access for restoration, not salvage rights. Caroline met her gaze without flinching. The army had taught her how to deal with authority, how to stand her ground without being confrontational. I understand I did the right thing by reporting it, Ms. Albright, she replied, her voice quiet but firm. The rest is up to the lawyers. My only concern was securing the site and ensuring this was handled correctly. The simple, direct honesty of her statement seemed to momentarily disarm the lawyer. She had expected a fight, a greedy claimant, not this calm, composed veteran. Albright gave a curt nod, a flicker of respect in her eyes before the professional mask slipped back into place. Of course, she said, turning back to the tunnel. We'll see what the official assessment reveals. Caroline watched them, the sheriff and the lawyer, two powerful forces circling a discovery that had, until this morning, been hers alone. She felt a profound sense of detachment, the simple, tangible goal of building a bike path now buried under a mountain of legal procedure and competing claims. News in a small town like Blackwood doesn't travel, it ignites. By nightfall, the story of Caroline Hayes and the tunnel treasure was on everyone's lips, a wildfire of gossip and speculation that swept through the local diner, the post office, and the aisles of the grocery store. The facts, already extraordinary, were quickly embellished into a full-blown local legend. The amount of money grew with each telling. It was $1 million. It was $5 million. By the time the story reached the bar at the edge of town, it was $10 million in gold bars. Caroline became an instant celebrity, a role she was deeply and profoundly uncomfortable with. When she went into town for supplies the next day, the normal, quiet anonymity she valued was gone. Conversations stopped. People stared. Some offered hearty congratulations, slapping her on the back as if she'd won the lottery. Others looked at her with a strange mixture of awe and pity. She could have been rich, she heard one woman whisper to another in the checkout line. Lord knows I'd have taken that money and been on a beach in Mexico by now. The sentiment, she discovered, was a common one. To many, her honesty wasn't admirable, it was foolish. She felt like an exhibit in a zoo, her integrity a strange and baffling curiosity. The one interaction that mattered came from the one person whose history was intertwined with her discovery. Mr. Henderson, the town clerk, found her as she was leaving the post office. He approached her not with the intrusive curiosity of the others, but with a quiet, solemn gravity. His watery blue eyes, which had once seemed merely old, now looked heavy with the weight of a long-held story. Caroline, he said, his voice a low murmur, I heard the news, about what you found. He led her to a bench overlooking the town square. My grandfather, the one who ran the hardware store, he never talked about it much. But my grandmother told me, Henderson and Sons Hardware, it wasn't just a store. During the Depression, they were a front for the bank's emergency logistics, a way to move assets without causing a panic. He paused, his gaze distant. The courier they sent into the tunnel that day, his name was Daniel. Daniel Albright. No relation to that lawyer, I'm sure. He was a young man, just 21. He was engaged to be married to a girl from the next town over. When he disappeared, everyone assumed he'd run off with the money. It broke his family's heart. His fiancée. She waited for 2 years before she finally married someone else. Mr. Henderson turned to look at her, and for the first time, Caroline saw not just a town clerk, but a keeper of ghosts. That money doesn't matter. Not really, he said, his voice thick with emotion. You solved a 70-year-old mystery, Caroline. You gave that boy's story an ending. You cleared his name. In that moment, the whispers and the stares, the legal wrangling and the crushing weight of the discovery, all of it receded. Mr. Henderson's words gave her a sense of purpose that had been missing since she made the phone call. She hadn't just found a fortune. She had unearthed a tragedy and, in doing so, had offered a measure of justice. The counting took place in a secure, climate-controlled room in the basement of the county bank. The sterile, fluorescent, lit environment was the antithesis of the dark, organic tunnel. Federal agents had been called in, given the age and potential historical significance of the currency. Caroline was there, along with Sheriff Brody, Ms. Albright, and a handful of bank officials, all watching through a thick pane of glass as glove technicians worked with silent, methodical precision. The scene was surreal. They carefully unwrapped each oilcloth cylinder, the waxy fabric crackling under the bright lights. The old straw was brushed away and discarded. Each bundle of currency was then unrolled. The bills flattened and fed into a modern counting machine that whirred and clicked, its digital display ticking upward at a dizzying pace. The process took 2 full days. The sheer volume of cash was staggering. Finally, the lead federal agent, a man with a perpetually serious expression, entered the viewing room holding a single sheet of paper. "We have completed the authentication and the final tally," he announced, his voice devoid of emotion. "The total value of the currency in 1930 $1 is $1.2 million. After adjusting for inflation and assessing the numismatic value of the bills as collector's items, the current estimated value is $5.7 million. The number hung in the air, a figure of such magnitude it seemed to suck the oxygen from the room. $5.7 million. The legal battle began before the last bill was even stacked. The Atlantic Railroad Trust, through Ms. Albright, filed a formal claim for the entire amount, citing their ownership of the property. The county filed a claim, arguing the money was abandoned property found within their jurisdiction. And, in a surprising twist, a law firm representing the distant corporate descendants of the defunct Merchants Bank of the Valley also filed a claim. Caroline, feeling utterly out of her depth, hired a modest local lawyer named Arthur Davies, a kind, retired man with a gentle demeanor and a sharp mind. The pressure was immense. One afternoon, a lawyer from a big city firm, a man whose suit probably cost more than her truck, approached her outside the courthouse. He was all polished shoes and predatory smile. "Ms. Hayes, my firm would like to represent you," he said, his voice a smooth, persuasive purr. "We can argue that this falls under treasure trove laws. Finders keepers, Ms. Hayes. It's the American way. We can fight for the whole amount, and you'd never have to worry about money again." The offer was tempting, a siren song of easy wealth. But as she looked at the lawyer's slick, confident face, she thought of Daniel, the young courier who died in the dark. She thought of Mr. Henderson's gratitude. She thought of her own simple, original goal. "No, thank you," she said firmly, her voice leaving no room for argument. "I'm not interested in the American way. I'm interested in the right way." She walked away, leaving the lawyer staring after her in disbelief. That night, she sat in her small kitchen, the legal papers from Mr. Davies piled on the table. She felt more isolated than ever, the simple, honorable act of making a phone call having buried her under a mountain of paperwork, public scrutiny, and the crushing weight of a $5.7 million problem. The courtroom was small and paneled in dark wood that had absorbed the gravitas of 100 years of small-town disputes. Sunlight, thick with dancing dust motes, cut across the room in sharp angles, illuminating the worn faces of the spectators who had come to witness the final chapter of the Tunnel Treasure Saga. For months, the story had been the lifeblood of the town, and now they sat in quiet anticipation. Caroline sat beside her lawyer, Arthur Davies, her hands resting calmly in her lap. She felt strangely detached, an observer in her own life story. The drone of the lawyers had been the soundtrack to her life for weeks, a numbing recitation of legal precedents and jurisdictional claims. They spoke of in rem jurisdiction, salvage rights, and escheatment, words that felt alien and disconnected from the physical reality of the cold, dark alcove and the heavy, cloth-wrapped cylinders. Her mind wasn't on their arguments. It was in the tunnel, picturing the remaining tons of rock that still needed to be cleared, the precise angle for the new drainage culverts, the load, bearing capacity of the new steel supports she wanted to order. The judge, a man with a kind, weary face and a shock of white hair, finally silenced the room by clearing his throat. He looked down at the mountain of paperwork before him, then peered over his spectacles, his gaze settling on Caroline. He summarized the case with a clarity that cut through the legal fog. He acknowledged the claims of the Atlantic Railroad Trust as the property owners, the county's claim for its administrative and security costs, and the tenuous claim of the corporation that had absorbed the long-defunct Merchants Bank. He spoke of Daniel Albright, the courier, whose only living relatives were too distant to have a legal standing, but whose memory, the judge noted, loomed large over the proceedings. Then he delivered his ruling. The bulk of the money, he explained, as unclaimed assets from a failed financial institution, would by law be absorbed by the state treasury. Ms. Albright's face tightened, but she kept her professional composure. The county, the judge continued, would be awarded 5% of the total value to cover its expenses. Finally, he turned to Caroline. He cited the state's treasure trove and salvage laws, which made specific provisions for a finder who, through significant personal effort, risk, and expense, recovers lost or abandoned property. Ms. Hayes did not simply stumble upon this, the judge said, his voice resonating in the quiet room. She leased a condemned and dangerous property with the intent to improve it for public use. She single-handedly excavated it, and upon her discovery, she acted with a level of integrity that is, frankly, commendable. She secured the site and reported it immediately, when she could have easily done otherwise. He paused, letting the words sink in. Therefore, under the provisions of state law, the court awards a finder's and salver's fee of 20% of the authenticated value to Ms. Caroline Hayes. A collective gasp went through the courtroom. Arthur Davies squeezed her arm, his face breaking into a wide, ecstatic grin. 20% of $5.7 million was $1.14 million. It was a number so vast, so life-altering, that it didn't feel real. Caroline felt not a surge of elation, but a slow, profound release of attention she hadn't even realized she was holding. It was the feeling of a mission objective being confirmed, of a complex problem finally being solved. Outside the courthouse, the autumn air was crisp and clean. Mr. Davies was practically dancing on the pavement. "We did it, Caroline. We did it. You're a wealthy woman," he exclaimed, his voice booming. Caroline looked at her lawyer, a genuine, grateful smile touching her lips. Then she looked past him, her gaze fixed on the distant ridge of the mountains, the dark line of the pass just visible against the blue sky. "I'm a project manager, Mr. Davies," she said, her voice quiet but firm, filled with a renewed sense of purpose. "And my project is behind schedule." Her first action was not to buy a new car or a bigger house. It was to meet with a financial planner, a serious woman who spoke in terms of long-term growth and stable foundations. With meticulous care, Caroline established an irrevocable trust for Lily, a fortress of funds that would guarantee her education and her future, a legacy of security that felt more valuable than any amount of cash. Her second meeting was with Eleanor Albright. The power dynamic had shifted completely. They met not in a stuffy office, but at a neutral cafe. Caroline, no longer a hopeful lessee but a serious buyer, made a generous, all-cash offer to purchase the Blackwood Pass tunnel outright, along with a 50-acre parcel of land at each entrance. Ms. Albright, ever the pragmatist, saw the wisdom in the deal. The railroad would be permanently rid of a notorious liability and would turn a tidy profit. The paperwork was drawn up in a week. The tunnel was hers. With the deed in hand, she incorporated. Courier's Path Restoration LLC was officially born. She didn't waste money on a fancy office, instead investing it in top-of-the-line equipment, tools that were efficient, reliable, and safe. She bought a new, powerful generator, pneumatic drills, and custom, forged steel beams. Then came the most important investment, her crew. She didn't put an ad in the paper. She opened a small, worn notebook and started making calls. The names were of men she had served with or knew from veteran support networks, men with skills who had found it hard to translate their military experience into the civilian world. Her first hire was a man named Marcus, a former combat engineer like herself, who had been working a dead-end job stocking shelves at a big box store. She met him for coffee, laying out the blueprints on the table. "The pay is good, the work is hard, and the mission is clear," she told him, her voice resonating with the quiet authority of a commander. "We're not just clearing rock, Marcus. We're building something." He looked at the plans, then at her, and she saw a spark in his eyes that had likely been dormant for years. "When do we start, ma'am?" he asked, the honorific slipping out naturally. She had her crew, a small, dedicated team who understood the meaning of a mission. The money, she realized, was just a tool, no different from her sledgehammer or a stick of dynamite. It was a means to an end. The real reward was this: the freedom to execute her vision, the quiet satisfaction of ownership, the empowerment of leading a team toward a shared, tangible goal. She was in command again, not of a platoon in a war zone, but of a construction crew on a mountain, and it felt more right than anything had in years. The work progressed with military efficiency. With a full crew and the right equipment, the remaining tons of rock and debris were cleared in a matter of weeks. Under Caroline's exacting direction, they reinforced the entire length of the tunnel, paved a smooth, wide asphalt path, and installed a state-of-the-art drainage system. The transformation was breathtaking. One evening, after the crew had gone home, Caroline walked the length of the finished tunnel alone. The air, once stagnant and heavy, now moved in a cool, gentle breeze that smelled of the forest and the fresh cedar of the new support beams. The oppressive darkness was gone, replaced by the warm, inviting glow of the solar-powered, vintage-style lanterns she had installed along the arched ceiling. They cast long, soft shadows, making the tunnel feel less like a passage and more like a sanctuary. She walked slowly, her boots silent on the new pavement, running her hand along the smooth, cool rock wall. She stopped at the place where the alcove had been. The wall was seamless now, a masterful piece of stonework and concrete that blended perfectly with the surrounding rock. There was no sign of the opening, no hint of the secret it had once held. But set into the wall at eye level was a small, discreet bronze plaque, its polished surface gleaming in the lantern light. The inscription was simple, etched in elegant script: "In memory of Daniel Albright, 1910-1931. His final delivery is complete." She had given him a name and a resting place, turning his tomb into a memorial. At the main entrance, beneath a handsome new wooden awning that her crew had built, she had installed a professional, weatherproof display case. It was her own small museum. Inside, carefully arranged on a backing of dark velvet, was one of the original oilcloth wrappers, brittle and stained with age. Beside it lay a few of the more damaged, lower denomination bills, artifacts of a bygone era. The centerpiece was a concise, beautifully written history she had commissioned from a local historian. It told the story of the Merchants' Bank of the Valley, of the desperation of the Great Depression, and of the brave young courier who had walked into the mountain and never walked out. She hadn't just built a path. She had preserved a story, weaving the history of the place into its new future. She stood there for a long time, feeling the cool breeze on her face, a sense of profound completion settling over her. The tunnel was no longer a place of collapse and decay, but a place of connection and remembrance. The grand opening of the Courier's Path was held on a perfect evening in late summer. The sun was setting behind the Appalachian Ridge, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple. It seemed the entire town of Blackwood had turned out. The air was filled with the sounds of a local bluegrass band, the sizzle of hot dogs on a grill, and the happy chatter of families. Caroline stood near the entrance with Lily, who was now a proud, confident 11-year-old, wearing a T-shirt with the new Courier's Path logo. Caroline watched the crowd, a sea of familiar faces. She saw Sheriff Brody, no longer a skeptic but a genuine friend, who gave her a warm, respectful nod from across the way. She even spotted Eleanor Albright near the back, her severe suit replaced by casual slacks, a look of grudging admiration on her face as she surveyed the professional, high-quality result of the project. The guest of honor was Mr. Henderson. He looked frail, leaning on a cane, but his eyes were bright with a joy that seemed to light him from within. Caroline handed him a large pair of ceremonial scissors. He stood before the wide red ribbon that was stretched across the tunnel's entrance, flanked by Caroline and Lily. "I never thought I'd see this day," he said, his voice trembling with emotion. "My grandfather, Daniel, they'd be so proud." With a snip of the scissors, The ribbon fell away, and the crowd erupted in cheers. Lily threw her arms around her mother's waist, hugging her tightly. "You did it, Mom," she whispered, her voice filled with awe. "You really, really did it." Caroline looked down at her daughter, her heart swelling with a love so fierce it almost hurt. She looked out at the cheering crowd, at the smiling faces of the men on her crew, at the proud, tearful face of Mr. Henderson. Then she looked at the tunnel itself, its entrance a perfect, glowing archway leading into the heart of the mountain. "No, sweetie," she said, her own voice thick with an emotion she no longer had to suppress. "We did it." As the sun finally dipped below the horizon, the lanterns inside the tunnel brightened, their warm light spilling out onto the joyful crowd. They looked like a constellation, a string of man-made stars pulled down from the sky and threaded through the earth. A group of local kids, the first official users of the path, rang their bicycle bells and pedaled into the passage, their whoops of laughter echoing softly in the twilight. Caroline watched them go until their lights were just tiny, receding stars in the distance. A profound sense of peace washed over her, a quiet stillness she hadn't felt since before the wars, before David, before the long, hard years of just surviving. The ghosts of her past, the soldiers she had lost, the young man who had died in the dark, they all seemed to be at rest. The wind that blew from the tunnel mouth no longer felt like a stale breath from a forgotten tomb, but a fresh, clean breeze carrying the scent of cedar, cool stone, and redemption. She stood there for a long time, a quiet, genuine smile on her face, a builder who had not just restored a tunnel, but had built a future.